Okay, hello to this lecture on human rights perspective to crisis in Europe. I'm Hanna Tuominen from the Network for European Studies at the University of Helsinki. Today's lecture has the following contents. First, we are dealing with the importance of human rights for the European project, and then why the crisis needs to be considered from a human rights perspective. And some examples about what kind of consequences the crisis has had for human rights realization in Europe. As you can see, human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights are the values on which the European Union is founded. Embedded in the Treaty of European Union, they have been reinforced by the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Countries seeking to join the EU must respect human rights, and so must countries which have concluded trade and other agreements with the EU. On this basis, I claim that the European Union is a community of values, and human rights are at the core of this value basis. The EU also received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012 for the advancement of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Human rights are also considered to be the silver thread that runs through everything the EU does externally. So, in a sense, European Union is considered to be an example for others in human rights issues. Then, why we should really take this human rights perspective to economic crisis. The global economic crisis has devastating effects on lives and livelihoods across the world. It should be remembered that the poorest countries and the poorest people, especially women and children, as well as migrants and minorities, are being hardest hit by the consequences of economic downturns. The economic crisis threatens the full range of human rights. It threatens not only economic, social, and cultural rights, but also civil and political rights. By taking a human rights perspective to crisis, it can be reminded that governments have binding obligations to ensure that all their economic and social policies are consistent with human rights law. These responsibilities cannot be left only up to the market. And in times of crisis, governments must take active role in human rights realizations. And the causes as well as the consequences of the crisis can be located in human rights decisions and concrete actions or inactions of governments and powerful economic actors, and they are not outside of human control. So in a sense, the devastating effects of the crisis are not inevitable, nor should they be acceptable. So, is there a human rights crisis in Europe? In the case of Europe, economic crisis has had several serious consequences for human rights. In this lecture, I'm pointing out some of the most evident but also some quite surprising consequences of the crisis for human rights realization in Europe. The EU member states have responded to crisis through measures which have influenced human rights in many ways. The human rights reality in some areas of Europe is really in crisis. But member states also differ in their responses to crisis. And of course, the consequences of the economic crisis are not equally distributed across the EU member states. Some states, such as Greece, are more severely hit by the crisis. And the anti-crisis packages have also different effects for different population groups. Usually those already disadvantaged are particularly at risk, like minorities, migrants, and especially children. This leads to the question, is the protection of human rights really a priority inside the European Union? One of the most serious examples of the economic crisis is the rising levels of unemployment, as well as poverty figures. The ongoing economic crisis led to increasing long-term unemployment in Europe, and long-term unemployment is closely linked with the high risk of poverty. In October 2013, the unemployment rate was 12.1 in Euro area. The EU 28 unemployment rate was 10.9. What this actually means is that more than 26 million men and women are unemployed in the EU 28. In comparison, these figures are higher than in October 2012. There are clear differences among the member states. Lowest unemployment rates are in Austria, Germany, and Luxembourg, while highest rates are in Greece and Spain. And of course, other groups like youth are more influenced by the unemployment rates. And the rates are usually twice as high for the younger people under 25 than for the all populations. What the unemployment means in practice, it of course means a loss of earnings and poverty, as I already mentioned, but can also have more serious long-term consequences for the individual, like loss of self-esteem, depression, and social exclusion. Here you can see the long-term unemployment rates by sex. And there you can see the blue line is for women, the green line is for men, and the yellow is the total level of long-term unemployment, which of course means that people that have been unemployed continuously for more than 1 year. And here is another figure which shows the youth unemployment rates, so for persons under 25. They are much higher than the unemployment rates for all ages, as I already said. This is also true among other already disadvantaged groups such as immigrants, ethnic minorities, temporary agency workers, and low-skilled people. This is because in a recession, employers tend to make less use of formal recruitment channels and more of the informal networks of their current employees. This makes it harder for the minority groups and foreign nationals to find employment. Also, older workers can be excluded from training programs, and young people don't find jobs open to those without experience. Also, more temporary, unprotected jobs are offered. Here you can see a variation between different EU states, and the youth employment rates are especially high in countries like Spain, as you can see. In the Northern Europe, these rates are much lower. And also in the other southern countries, these figures seems to be almost 40%. Here is another picture of at risk of poverty or social exclusion rate, 2011 and 2012. In 2012, 124.5 million people, or almost 25% of the population in the EU 28, were at risk of poverty or social exclusion. The indicator is defined as the share of the population in at least one of the following three conditions: at risk of poverty, meaning below the poverty threshold, in a situation of severe material deprivation, or living in a household with very low work intensity. If we take out of this only the poverty rates, another statistic tells that almost 70% of the European population is poor, meaning that their disposable income was below their national at risk of poverty threshold. According to country, age, gender, or origin, the poverty rates are varying considerably. Across the European Union, the poverty rate of women is higher than of men. It is at 70.1 against 15.7 for men. What is noticeable is that 20.2 of children under 16 years of age are poor in Europe. The northern countries show a lower rate, around 10%, while highest rates are observed in Romania, 31.3%, and in Bulgaria, 26.4%, or in Spain, 25.3%. Children with a migrant background were at a greater risk of poverty than children whose parents were native born. You can also see that there is diminishing amount of public spending in times of crisis. Social protection systems should seek to continue providing support at a satisfactory or adequate level. And especially we have seen cuts in public health, education, and social welfare. Many of these have consequences for children. Another example of the consequences of the economic crisis is the situation of migrants and minorities in Europe. European countries continue to strengthen immigration controls at their borders as well as in transit countries. As a result, migrants' roads become more and more dangerous. During the 2 decades, it is estimated that more than 25,000 migrants have died at sea when trying to travel to Europe. In a context of major economic crisis, the situation doesn't seem likely to improve. One of the most recent examples is the accident that happened in the beginning of October in Lampedusa, where more than 360 people were killed. Most of the victims were African. Also, Europe's Muslims and Roma population experience persistent hostility and discrimination. Especially the right-wing extremist parties have taken Muslims as their target. Migration issue has really become a European issue, but the burden of migration crisis is not equally shared by European states. There is a sad consequence of the migration. This is from the Lampedusa accident. There is also rising levels of racism and xenophobia in Europe. Article 21 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union prohibits discrimination on any grounds, including gender, race, color, ethnic or social group, nationality, genetic features, language, religion or belief, political or other convictions, membership of a minority group, disability, age and sexual orientation. Separate legislation prohibits racist and xenophobic speech and crime. It bans, through criminal law, incitement to violence and hatred based on race, color, religion, descent, or national or ethnic origin. Despite a number of legal instruments that offer protection against racism and related forms of intolerance, ethnic and religious minorities across the EU continue to face racism, discrimination, verbal and physical violence, and exclusion. Economic crisis can lead to increased racism and xenophobia against minority groups, especially foreign nationals. This is what has happened in several countries in Europe. In Greece, Italy, and Eastern European countries, there have been violent attacks against migrants. At the same time, especially the Southern European countries must face growing amount of migrant flows from Africa and Asia. It doesn't help that often these countries are hardest hit by the economic crisis. According to research, anti-foreign sentiment is higher among those who are unemployed. Also, the higher the gross domestic product per capita, is the lower, in general, the level of support for ethnic intolerance. Also, there is common perception that migrants take away jobs or scarce welfare benefits. And there is also wide support for returning unemployed immigrants to their home countries. Economic downturns also tend to raise the level of support for political extremism. And here you can see further reading dealing with the Europe's own human rights crisis, or the International Federation of Red Cross report on the humanitarian impacts of the economic crisis in Europe. And then there is also Human Rights Watch report on human rights in Europe, and several links on this issue.